Welcome to Politics and Prose. Those of us of a certain age, and I see some people in the audience who meet this test with me, remember the rasping, huger voice of Elmer Davis, who wrote a wonderful book called 2 Minutes Till Midnight, long before it was legitimate to ban nuclear tests. And he played a wonderful Paul Revere function of warning us about nuclear dangers and threats with that book. Now we have our own Paul Revere and Joe Cirincione with his nuclear nightmares. And apart from the substance, which is reason enough, I wanted to do this event because Joe and I go back 30 years when he was a Capitol...
High school.
Not quite. And I might have been your teacher then. But he was a Capitol Hill staff member, and my colleagues and I were working on how to block the stupidity of the MX missile, a weapon that was never built, and Joe played a significant role in helping achieve that result and prevent it from being a first strike weapon. So I've been working these issues for over 50 years. And I doubt that I could pass Donald Regan's test of the throw weight. You may remember he talked about, in a not uncommon way, said that women can't be involved in nuclear policy because they wouldn't understand what a throw weight is. I still don't understand what a throw weight is, but I think you can be involved in nuclear policy in a very informed way. And nuclear nightmares helps us get there. And Joe's going to explain the book. He's also going to relate it to the current situation, which he and I and many others are working on how to keep the diplomatic flag flying on Iran and how to make sure that it's unfurled and not stomped on. So let's welcome Joe Cirincione to Politics and Prose and Nuclear Nightmares.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind and gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here. I love this bookstore. I come as often as I can, even when I'm not speaking. And the coffee house itself and the wonderful treasures you find just browsing the shelves. It's a wonderful, wonderful institution for Washington. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that none of you woke up this morning thinking about nuclear weapons. And why should you? You know, with any luck, you woke up with some happy thoughts. Maybe you looked outside your window at the beautiful vista the winter has for us today. But if you did wake up troubled, you were probably thinking about some personal issue or family or maybe work-related. And of course, these are the kinds of problems that we think about mostly in our lives. If we go a little circle out, maybe it's problems that our community's facing, our state, our nation. But of all these troubles and problems that we face, there are only two that threaten destruction on a planetary scale. And that's global warming and nuclear weapons. These are threats that have been created by machines that we made. They threaten to destroy everything else that we've made, including civilization itself. But both of these threats are preventable, reversible even. But they both require new ways of thinking and new leaders who are willing to take the risks that change entails. And I say that because on both of these policies, we face deniers, people who deny that there isn't even a problem, or worse, recommend solutions that actually make the problem worse, make it more dangerous, make it more likely. There's a whole section probably on global warming. I'm just going to talk about nuclear weapons today. But in talking about it, you may hear some things that resonate about the other challenge as well. So let's get grounded. What are we worried about? What are we talking about? What's the threat from a nuclear weapon? let's take the warhead that was built for the MX missile. It's like a magic act. Pick a card. Any card. Let's pick the warhead for the MX missile, the W-87. We now deploy this. We stopped the MX missile. This thing was built at the cost of billions of dollars and then retired. But we took that warhead and we now put it on the Minuteman III. We have 450 of these long-range, what they call intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have about 500 of these warheads. Suppose a terrorist got one of these warheads and put it in a van and drove it down to the White House and was stopped at the first concrete barrier protecting the White House, and then set off this 300 kiloton device. That's about 20 times the size of the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Instantly, the White House would be vaporized, and every building within about a 20-block square area, radius, including the Plowshares Fund office up on 14th and K. The blast from that one weapon would destroy every building up to and including the National Cathedral. All residential buildings would be completely destroyed. All reinforced concrete buildings would be severely damaged, depending on how far away they were from the blast. And the fire from that blast would burn every book in Politics and Prose, and of course the neighborhood itself. So that's the level of destruction we're talking about. We have never, as human beings, experienced anything like that. The two most horrible, destructive, nation-changing days we've probably had as a nation are Pearl Harbor and the Twin Tower destruction on 9/11. Those were horrible days. More people have died in an individual day of battle during the Civil War, but those two events destroyed much more, not only killed people, but destroyed lives and changed the direction of the country. A nuclear weapon would make those pale in comparison. There would be huge destruction. Most of the population of Washington, D.C. destroyed, most of the buildings destroyed, no help. The first responders would be dead, and their equipment would be destroyed. People would have to come down from Poolsville and Rockville to start combing the smoldering debris for survivors. And of course, this would change the politics of the nation forever. You could take the Bill of Rights and put it up on the shelf and you might never see it again. Not because some dictator was taking advantage of this for his own purposes or her own purposes, because the people would be demanding draconian search and seizure. You think NSA is searching your emails now? Wait till something like this happens and the people would demand activities be taken to prevent that from ever happening again. So what's the risk of this? What's the chances of something like this actually happening, a terrorist getting one of these warheads? Thankfully, very small. It's highly unlikely that a terrorist could get one of the U.S. warheads. Chances are a little better that they might be able to get a Russian warhead or a Pakistani warhead or a warhead from one of the other. There are a total of 9 countries, including North Korea, that have nuclear weapons now, perhaps a weapon from there. And if they could get it, they could have an easier job smuggling it into the country. The weapons like this can be easily shielded to evade radiation detectors. Sam Nunn jokes, if a terrorist wanted to get a weapon into the country, they should hide it in a bale of marijuana. We know we can't stop that from coming in. And of course, there's no shortage of suicide bombers who would detonate such a device. But even so, the chances are quite small. Most countries protect their weapons very well, protect the material needed to build these weapons very well, but it's not zero. And what happens is when you plug this into the normal risk calculation formula, probability times consequences, the number you get is so large over here that even though the probability is small, the consequences are so enormous that you've got to do something about this and take this seriously and do everything you can to prevent it from happening. And we do. We do a lot. We spend about $2 billion a year as a country to try to secure the materials and the weapons, not just our own, but help other countries do that, particularly in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. About $2 billion. That's not a bad program. It pales in comparison to the rest of the Department of Defense programs. The Pentagon budget is about, depending on which year you're looking, about $550 billion. So $2 billion is a small fraction of that. But we also have other things to worry about. Nuclear terrorism, the risk that I mentioned, is considered the #1 risk to the United States, according to the National Security Strategy of the United States. This is what the National Security Strategy says. And it hasn't said that just under Barack Obama. It said that under George W. Bush as well. The second most serious threat we face is the risk of other countries getting these weapons. So mostly we're talking about the risk of Iran and North Korea, the two countries that have active programs. North Korea has actually detonated 3 nuclear devices. The last one last year, a fairly successful test. Iran is widely considered to be seeking at least the technology for a weapon, and perhaps a weapon itself. We spend about another $2 to $3 billion a year. Amy Wolf's in the audience from the Congressional Research Service. She can tell me exactly how much we spend, but it's in that ballpark, several $billion a year on what you might consider non-proliferation programs trying to prevent the spread of these weapons. So all told, it might be something like $5, $6, $7, $8 billion a year on terrorism and non-proliferation. Again, a small slice of what we spend on everything else. Most of our defense budget goes to other threats, other missions, other duties. There is a mismatch between our threats and our dollars. We're not putting our money where our threats are. And that's a problem. A lot of what we spend our money on is nuclear weapons, our own. We spend about $35 billion a year on our own nuclear weapons. And this is actually the third great risk we face. So nuclear terrorism, nuclear proliferation, it's the risk from the weapons themselves, that something will go wrong. I know I'm here to promote my own book, but Eric Schlosser has written this great book. Eric Schlosser wrote Fast Food Nation, later made into a movie. I hope someone makes this into a movie. Command and Control just came out last year, about the risk we face from our own nuclear weapons, how we almost blew up Arkansas, how we accidentally bombed North Carolina. You know, the accidents we've had where we came this close. A B-52 flying over North Carolina had an accident. The wing was ripped off. The wing falls down. The bombs are released. The bombs drop. One of these bombs plummets all the way to the ground. The parachute opens. It delivers. There are 7 safety mechanisms that are supposed to prevent that bomb from going off. 6 of them fail. A switch, a tiny switch that costs a couple of dollars, held. And that's the reason why North Carolina is still here and wasn't destroyed back during this accident. But it's not just ancient history. In 2007, an air crew flying a B-52 bomber, this is one of our strategic bombers, from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, loaded up 6 cruise missiles, and they flew them down to the air base, Barksdale Air Base in Louisiana. They were retiring these weapons. They were slated for destruction, 6 conventional cruise missiles. However, they had accidentally loaded on nuclear-armed cruise missiles. The crew didn't know this. The pilots didn't know this. The officials at either base didn't know this. They sat on the tarmac overnight, protected by just the normal security, a barbed wire fence and a couple of guards. In the morning, one of the local crew comes and looks, and they look on the cruise missile, and they see there's a little red dot that indicates nuclear. That's the only distinguishing characteristic. And he goes and tells the commander. The commander doesn't believe him. This is impossible. But they go and check, and sure enough, there were 6 nuclear-armed missiles flying there, each one 10 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So 60 Hiroshimas accidentally transported. The worst news, the Minot Air Force Base didn't even know they were missing. Didn't even know they were missing. Now, everything turned out okay. They were taken back. Everything was all right. People were fired. Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, fired the Secretary of the Air Force, both the civilian and the military heads of the Air Force. First time in U.S. history this had ever happened, that anything this bad had happened, and it happened over this. But if this kind of thing is happening in a country with the best command and control system, what's happening in Russia? What's happening in Pakistan? These are the kinds of things you have to worry about, that a nuclear weapon will be used by accident, by miscalculation, or intentionally is a conventional conflict that escalates and gets out of control. If there are 17,000 nuclear weapons in the world, if you leave these things hanging around in fallible human hands, it is inevitable that they will be used. It is inevitable. The risks are relatively small, but they are not zero. And you multiply that risk times years, and one of these things is going to go off. So we're in a race to try to bring these numbers down to the lowest levels possible, and if possible, eliminate them entirely before one of these things goes off. And we have the worst mass casualty event in human history. So in large part, that's what Nuclear Nightmares is about, walking you through some of those, talking about those issues. But those three risks, those are the standard risks we talk about: terrorism, proliferation, the risk of the weapons themselves. There's a fourth risk. Even if you do your own calculation, you decide, look, I'm not going to think about this tomorrow either. It's just too remote. It's so unlikely. Think about the money. Think about the money. We are now set to replace every single nuclear weapon in our arsenal. These weapons have a lifetime. It's a long lifetime, but at some point they end. They have to be replaced like a car. And all of the weapons in our arsenal are reaching the end of their operational life. So by the end of in the 2020s, 2030s, the bombers are going to have to be pulled out of service. The submarines are going to be pulled out of service. The missiles are going to be pulled out of service. And there have to be replacement programs to take care of them. And we have in place some of the best contractors and military service personnel in the world dedicated to these nuclear weapons. And they are doing their job. They're coming up with programs to replace every single one of them. Every missile, every bomber, every sub, every nuclear warhead. This is what we pay them to do. This is what they're doing. And no one's told them not to. So they're just doing their job. And the bills are starting to come in. There's a new report from the Monterey Institute coming out on January 7th, next week. They estimate that the cost of replacing our subs, missiles, bombers, and warheads over the next 30 to 40 years will be $1 trillion. It will cost us $1 trillion to replicate this Cold War force that we still have. And the contracts are moving through Congress. The budget we just passed has almost $1 billion for research for the next nuclear-armed submarine. So let me talk about that sub, just so you understand what's going on. We have 14 Trident submarines in the U.S. fleet, evenly divided mostly between the Atlantic and the Pacific. They sail out of Georgia. They sail out of Washington State. Each has 24 tubes. They have an average of 4 warheads per missile on them. We're going to replace those starting at the end of 2020 so 2029, 2030. We're going to replace them with a fleet of 12, so not 14, 12, and they'll have fewer tubes, maybe 16, but again, an average of 4 warheads apiece. So by the middle of this century, in 2050, we're still going to have 800 hydrogen bombs patrolling the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Why? What is the purpose of those weapons? What is their mission? The cost for that sub alone, for doing that, for building that sub and operating it and maintaining over what we expect is its 50-year operating cycle, is $350 billion. Now, this comes at a time when the defense budget is shrinking, not as quickly as it could or as many would like, but it is shrinking. So this means that the services are starting to make choices. So the head of the Navy, the head of Navy operations, has warned that in the years when you're building that sub, you're not going to be able to build the conventional ships, the frigates, the destroyers, the cruisers that he's operating on. He expects it'll have to shed at least 14 to 20 of those ships in order to make room for this obsolete nuclear weapon that we're still going to build into the middle of this century. His solution is to have somebody else pay for it. They still want it, but they want the Department of Defense to pay for it, not the Navy. The Department of Defense has said no way, but they haven't come up with a solution yet. So this train wreck or sub wreck is coming. It's there. It's a fiscal problem. It's unsolved. Something's going to give. Either we're going to build this thing and lose conventional capability, or we're not going to build it and we're going to waste billions of dollars in the program, in the money that Congress has already voted. Because we have this procurement policy gap. The contracts are racing ahead of the policy. The president hasn't told the services to stop. He hasn't told the contractors to pause. So programs for a new bomber are working their way through Congress. Proposals for a new ICBM are in the wings. There's new warhead programs. We have a program that is going to modernize a bomb you probably never heard of called the B-61. The B-61 is a tactical nuclear weapon. It's dropped from airplanes. We put them in Europe in order to stop a Warsaw Pact attack with nuclear weapons. The Warsaw Pact dissolved over 25 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed almost 20 years ago, over 20. We still have 200 of these weapons. You know the bomb I told you about, the ICBM warhead? The B-61 is bigger. It has a yield about 340 kilotons, so about 12 times, 22 times the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A tactical weapon. The tactical weapons are the same yield in many cases as the strategic weapons. It's just how short the range is. This is something that's designed for in theater as opposed to flying in the oceans. But it's still up to a 340 kiloton weapon. Enormously destructive. Nobody thinks we're ever going to use this weapon. The planes that are supposed to use this would take 3 months to get them there and fit them out so that they could use this in time of a crisis. But the program to modernize this B-61, $11 billion. And it's working its way through the Congress. $11 billion. We calculated it out on the Plowshares Fund website. It is cheaper to build this weapon out of solid gold than it is to build it the way the contractors want to build it. In fact, it's worth twice its weight in gold compared to what we're going to do. These programs are working their way through Congress. This is going to cost you money. Or for some of you, your children money, your grandchildren money. In fact, children that are not yet born are going to be paying for the contracts that are now working their way through Congress. As the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Horst Cartwright, said, that's his nickname, Horst Cartwright, great guy. He said, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to be making 50-year decisions. So it's here. We're in this window. Because once you decide that you're going to build this thing, once you lock it in, once you start bending metal, it's almost impossible for Congress to stop the program. It's very, very hard. So if you don't want to have 800 nuclear weapons in the Atlantic and the Pacific in 2050, if you don't want your grandchildren or great-grandchildren paying for it, you better pay attention to this risk, to this threat, to our fiscal security, our fiscal stability. So that's the overview. That's a lot of what's in Nuclear Nightmares. What I want to talk about for the remaining few minutes I have before we open it up for questions is the most important nuclear policy issue we have facing us, which is Iran. And I say this is the most important because this is going to be decided in the next 6 months. This is in front of us. Like many of these issues, we want the president to wrestle with them. The president has tried to wrestle with them. They've had some solutions to some of them. There's been struggle over this, but it's largely a question of when the president wants to bring this up and when the Congress wants to bring this up. This issue, Iran, this is happening now. This is being forced on it. This is in everybody's inbox. And it affects everything else. If you can get Iran right, if you can stop their nuclear program, if you can show that diplomacy is a way to effectively and cheaply address even the most serious pressing threats, well, then that energizes diplomatic efforts across the board. In the region, to deal with North Korea, to deal with Russia. It encourages people to say, we can do this with Iran, we can do this with our own weapons, we can reduce it. But if you don't get it right, if you listen to some of the advice that the leading members of the Senate are telling the president, if you screw this up, then you're looking at war. If this deal fails, You are on a course for war with Iran. If the negotiations collapse, if Iran comes to the conclusion that they cannot make a deal with the United States and the West, if the United States comes to the conclusion we cannot make a deal, then you can bet that whatever you think Iran is doing, they're going to be doing that and more. The hardliners will win in Tehran, and they'll head off on a course racing towards nuclear weapons. The hardliners will win here. You will have this inevitable clash. And a war with Iran will make Iraq and Afghanistan look like a warm-up act. This is a major country with major resources, with major military forces. This is not going to be pretty. This is not going to be a pinprick. This is not going to be, oh, let's bomb Syria, or let's take out the Iraq reactor. This will be a major conflict. So this issue of war and peace is on the agenda now, 2014. It's going to be decided over the next 6 months. There are members of Congress who have introduced legislation to kill the negotiations. They don't call it that. They say it's going to help the president by laying out conditions that Iran has to meet before we'd agree to a deal that are impossible for Iran to meet. We can talk more about this if you want, and I'll get to this a little bit. But first I want to talk about what the problem is so you understand what we're dealing with and what the core issue is. It's all about enriching uranium. Short physics lesson. I promise this will be really quick. But I think it's important for us to understand what's going on here. Iran is enriching uranium, and they're enriching uranium to make fuel. In 1938, scientists discovered that if you shot a neutron at a uranium nucleus, you could split the nucleus. You could split it. They discovered fission. And in that fission process, the atom shot out more neutrons that could hit other nearby uranium atoms. And in the process, it let out energy, an enormous amount of energy, an amount of energy that was 100 million times greater than the normal chemical reactions that are the kind of energy we experience, from photosynthesis to the oxygen in our lungs to dynamite. Those are chemical reactions, the breaking and forming of electron bonds around the nucleus. But the nucleus, you split the nucleus, you get nuclear energy. And it's 100 million times greater than the chemical energy. The trick is you got to find the right uranium atom. Most of uranium is something called U-238. It weighs 238 units, atomic units. Perfectly nice atom. But it doesn't go pop. You hit it with a neutron and chances are it's not going to split. But a little less than 1% of natural uranium, 0.7%, is a very nice isotope called U-235, a little bit lighter than 238. And that is the one that goes pop. So what you want to do is get enough of those uranium-235 atoms close enough together so when you pop one, the rest of them pop and you get that chain reaction. One neutron, one atom, 2, 4, 8, 16. You see where this is going. This is the chain reaction that gives you nuclear energy. So how do you get those 235 closer together? You take uranium, you take it out of the ground. Iran has got plenty of uranium mines. You mill it up. You get rid of the rocks and the stuff you don't want, so you just get uranium powder. It looks kind of yellow, so they call it yellow cake. So this is yellow cake. It's from the mill that people usually have around. You take that powder and you put it with fluorine gas. You turn it into a gas, and now you have something called uranium hexafluoride. And then you can take that uranium hexafluoride and you can put it into a centrifuge. Iranian centrifuges are about this big. They look like skinny water heaters. Here's a centrifuge. Looks like that, more or less. And you put that uranium gas, uranium hexafluoride, which is now 0.7% U-235, you put it in and you spin it around real fast, supersonic speeds, tremendous pressure. And when you spin things around real fast in a centrifuge, now this is what we all know from chemistry class, right? The heavier elements go to the outside. The lighter elements are in the middle. You suck out that lighter gas now, which has a slightly higher ratio of 235 inside that, and you suck it out and you have slightly enriched uranium. But it's real slight. Not much at all. Few more atoms per cubic centimeter. Few more. So you have to do it again and again and again and again and again. And if you line 10,000 of these suckers up, and you do this for 3 or 4 months, you can stop. And you can have uranium that's now 3% U-235, 3% enriched uranium, maybe 4%, 5%, and you can stop right there and you can take that gas out and you can pound it and turn it into a powder and pound that powder into fuel pellets and stack the fuel pellets up into rods, and you put the rods in your reactor, you start the controlled reaction, you start getting heat, the heat turns the water to steam, the steam turns the turbines, and you get electricity. And here you are. 20% of the electricity in the United States is generated in exactly that way. But here's the problem. If you don't stop at 3 to 5%, if you keep those centrifuges going, you can go it all the way up to 90% uranium. 90% enriched uranium. Now 90% of that gas is U-235. It's all going to pop. So you can take that gas out and turn it into metal, and you can form a metal orange. You form that metal orange, you've got the core of a nuclear weapon. Same machines, same facilities, same process, same technology, fuel or bombs. So the question is, do you trust them? Do you trust that Iran is just making fuel, like they say, or this is secretly a plan to make weapons? And of course the answer is we don't trust them. Why should we trust them? They've been hiding this stuff. We discovered these facilities. They were trying to do this in secret. We have pretty good evidence that they were also working on nuclear weapons design during the 80s and 90s. So there's pretty good evidence there was a military dimension to this program, so we don't trust them. So the question is, how do you stop it? And that's the core of the deal that's on the table right now. The deal that was reached in November, right before Thanksgiving, is a deal that stops the program in place. First time in 10 years since they started doing this, since they started enriching uranium around 2003, 2004, first time we've actually stopped the program, aside from a short period where they voluntarily stopped it. Now they've stopped the program in place. They've rolled back key parts of it. They were enriching uranium to 20%. It's a special kind of fuel. There's a legitimate need for that. But the trouble is that gets them real close to bomb grade. So they agreed to stop enriching to 20% and to dispose of the stockpiles of 20% they already have and turn them into forms that couldn't readily be used for a bomb. We can talk more about that if you want. They allowed greater inspections of the facility to give us more confidence. So instead of having our IAEA, International Atomic Energy Inspectors, go there every week, every 2 weeks, now they get to go every day. So they can monitor what's going on and check what's going on in the plants. But that's just a temporary, and in exchange, we agreed to loosen up some financial sanctions that we put on Iran. We're going to give them access to about $7 billion of funds that are Iranian funds, but were being held in banks outside Iran that we froze. And we and the international community froze, not just us. So we are giving them about $7 billion of their own funds. They agree to halt the program, freeze it in place. They can do some work on it, but the expansion of the program, the creation of new enriched uranium is halted so that we can negotiate over the next 6 months a final agreement. And this is the sticking point. If Iran wants access to the other $100 billion that we've frozen, if they want the financial sanctions that have crippled their economy to be lifted, if they want to be able to do business in the modern world the way modern countries do, electronic transfer of bank funds, a system we cut them off of over the last couple of years, if they want to be able to do all this, and if they want to have the possibility of normalizing relations with the most powerful country in the world, that would be us, well, then they've got to satisfy us that this program is strictly for peaceful purposes and set up a much more intrusive inspection regime and scale it back and give up capability and scale it back. Ideally, you'd like to scale it back to 0. So that there aren't any centrifuges. So there's no enrichment, and in fact, that's the perfect solution. The way you can be sure that they're not enriching uranium for bombs is if they're not enriching at all. The problem is you can't get that deal. There isn't a politician in Iran that could make that deal. They would have made it in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 when they offered that deal to the Bush administration, and the Bush administration reaction, they didn't even answer. They didn't even answer. Why? Because Vice President Cheney said, we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it. So at the beginning of the Bush administration, there were 0 centrifuges enriching uranium in Iran. At the end, there were 8,000. That's where that strategy got us. That's how that strategy works. So now you're talking about how small can you go? Can you accept a deal where they have about 19,000 centrifuges now, about half working? Can you cut that in half? Can you cut down the facilities? Instead of 2 main facilities, can you cut them down to 1? Can you limit the quality of the centrifuges? Can you limit the amount of material they would produce? And can you increase the inspection so you can be sure that they're not building a bomb? If you can do that, that's a deal the United States and the other countries that are negotiating this, the other permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, are willing to take. We're willing to take that deal. There are some people who are not willing to take that deal, who do not want to make a deal, because they are still clinging to that neoconservative mantra. We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it. They're not interested in changing the behavior of the Iranian regime. They're interested in changing the regime. They want to overthrow this regime. That's the only way, in their view, that you can have real security. You've got to eliminate your threat. And the threat is the regime itself, not what the regime is doing. And that, you want to do that, that's going to take a war. And in fact, a war would not even do that. It would almost certainly rally the Iranian people around an otherwise unpopular regime, end all debate about whether you should build a nuclear weapon. It would be pedal to the metal, get a bomb as quickly as we can, because these crazy people in the United States are going to attack us. So that's the dialogue. That's the debate that's going on. And some of it is as black and white. Some of the people who are on the other side, who want to go to war with Iran, say this. But a lot of them don't. Senator Ben Cardin, for example. He's co-sponsored this act in the Senate. I voted for Senator Cardin. I gave Senator Cardin money. I generally like Senator Cardin. I wrote him the angriest email I have ever sent any elected representative. And I've sent some angry emails. I am ashamed that he is supporting this legislation introduced by Senator Menendez, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat from New Jersey, and Senator Kirk, Republican from Illinois. That this act that they have now got 47 co-sponsors on, AIPAC put out a press release, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee put out a press release saying that it got 47 co-sponsors, and they want to bring it to a vote this month, that Cardin is one of those senators. I think this is a disastrous policy that's going to lead this country into a war we don't need to wage, that is going to kill the best chance we've had in a decade to actually solve the problem. So even if you don't care about the money, you don't care about the terrorists, care about this. Care about war and peace. Care about what happens over the next 6 months. This could be the most consequential 6 months in U.S. national security strategy of the entire Obama administration. Either we solve this problem, which is right there, it's within reach, or we don't solve it and we start off and heading on a path to war. You thought this was behind us. You think we're pulling out of Afghanistan. We are. You think the Iraq's behind us. We are. The guys who got us into Iraq, the guys who blew the war in Afghanistan, they're the ones pushing the Iran policy. So if you regret that you didn't do enough to stop that disaster 10 years ago, your time has come. Pay attention. Do something about this. Go see where your senator stands on this. Okay, you're from D.C., I'm sorry. Go see where the senator that you contributed to stands on this, and what you can do about this, and what you can do about this policy. I'm going to stop my rant right now and open up for some questions and answers before I could go on all night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not at all. Joe Cirincione is really a member of the priesthood, the nuclear priesthood, the nuclear policy priesthood. He runs and is president of the Plowshares Fund, which is a magnificent organization of a foundation that deals with global security and links policy and activism and citizen action. And Plowshares, going way back, decades has done this, and Joe is leading the current effort in a way that adds balance to what we're dealing with. So I want to pose the first question, because you've given us a huge task, and it can seem overwhelming, but you have written in your book examples of where people have challenged this security establishment, have challenged the mentality that doesn't think you can ever come to an agreement, such as in New START. And tell us about how sometimes we can be giant killers of the children of darkness and evil. To quote Niebuhr.
The last chapter of my book is about activism. It's about my foundation, Plowshares Fund. We've been around for 32 years, and we raise money from generous donors and then try to find the smartest people in the world with the best ideas of how to eliminate these threats, and we give them the resources they need to get the job done. So if you either have money or need money, please see me after this talk. Or go to plowshares.org and take a look at what we do. But it's a history of activism. It's a history of people saying we can change this world. We can do something for the better. And we led a campaign. We spent about $3 million on a campaign to ratify the New START Treaty back in 2010. And we found groups like the Arms Control Association, Union of Concerned Scientists, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and others who were working on these issues, and teamed them up with some of the best experts at the Brookings Institution and the Carnegie Endowment, and teamed them up with grassroots activists out in the States like Peace Action, to try to put together an actual campaign to convince the Senate they should ratify this treaty. It took about a year, but it was successful. Most of the work was done by the senators, particularly John Kerry, who led the effort, and Senator Lugar, and by the administration itself. But this was decided on the margins. This was a close vote. Most arms control treaties end up passing with 90 votes, 80 votes. This passed with 71. You need 67 to pass a treaty. This barely got over the finish line. So in fights like this that are decided on the margins matter. So you can make a difference. We know this happened. We measured the activism in certain key states like Tennessee and Georgia, and we could see the correlation with the number of emails and letters going into those offices, the numbers of op-eds written in those states, the number of visits to those senators, and we correlated it very closely with how those senators came out. And the more activism, the more push there was, the more senators voted in favor of the treaty. So we think we can do this. But of course, that's just one small example. Many of us, it's understandable, feel discouraged that we can make a difference, that anything we do could possibly impact the world that we know. But we've all lived long enough to see this kind of change happen and realize after a while that it happens actually rather routinely, that we've lived long enough to see things that people said were impossible happen. I saw a mass movement end the Vietnam War. I saw Vietnam unite and welcome back the people who bombed it in the spirit of friendship and reconciliation. I saw the people of Eastern Europe overthrow dictatorships that had oppressed them for generations. I saw the Soviet Union collapse, Germany unite. I saw the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland who said never, never, never join, shake hands, and together rule a united Northern Ireland. I saw a man that was held in solitary confinement in a prison cell for 28 years emerge to become elected president of a free and majority-ruled South Africa. And I take my guideline from him, from Nelson Mandela, who said it's always impossible until you do it. And it's the same for this. It's the same for reducing the nuclear threats and ultimately eliminating the nuclear threats. You think we can't do this? I've seen the impossible happen repeatedly in my life, and I'm convinced that in my life I'm going to see this happen as well. Let's take some questions.
Let's rotate the questions, and we'll start with this microphone and then that microphone.
Go.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I thought you were leaving. You were just getting up to ask a question?
No, right.
Oh, okay.
Couple things. Your book, The Nuclear Nightmares, might make people think we need to increase the budget because we're nervous about what we and other people might do. So we have the START treaty here. Why aren't we downsizing instead of increasing the budget? I would like to hear if you have a reaction to Larry Korb, Miriam Pemberton put together a security budget rather than just a DOD budget. How can we get McCain to back off of his sabotaging of Kerry and the negotiations with Iran that are trying to go on? And hope everybody can support the Transform Now Plowshares 3 who were in detention in Georgia, sentencing January 28, write the judge.
Thank you. That's a different Plowshares, by the way. It's spelled differently. We spell it the English way, and we don't do civil disobedience. Nothing against that. We just don't do that. This is a lot of this is politics. It's a political battle. And your question, you got to defeat those who cannot be united. You've got to convince the majority of the Senate not to follow this path. And you got to convince them that John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Mr. Kirk, others, that their solution is not a solution. It's going to make things worse. It's a political fight. So you got the policy. You just got to marry it up, and so it's got to that. There's no secret to that. You got to defeat them. On the budget, I don't think you get rid of these nuclear nightmares by creating more of them. We don't need these weapons. I can't think of any military mission that requires us to use one nuclear weapon. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you need 10. There have been a leading member of the House Armed Services Committee proposed a few weeks ago using tactical nuclear weapons to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. So people are actually advocating this. But okay, so maybe maybe you need 10, maybe you need 100, maybe you need 500. We have 5,000, and they cost a fortune. So I think we can convince the policymakers, we can convince the Congress to roll these budgets back to reasonable levels. We're not going to convince them all at once to get rid of them, but if you get down to very low levels, that's the point where you can start to envision getting rid of them entirely. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all your questions, but I got a bunch of other people. Sir.
It comes close to a question you literally just answered, but maybe push it a little further. My question was going to be, since we don't have a Soviet Union, since we don't have a Warsaw Pact, how do we decide, on what basis do we decide at this stage how many things we do need? So the technical answer is that the President of the United States decides. These are his nuclear weapons. He decides. And we had great hope that President Obama, after his first national security speech, which was in April 2009 in Prague, which he devoted to nuclear weapons policy, where he outlined the clearest and most comprehensive nuclear policy I'd ever seen a president do, that he would do what he said, which is reduce the role and numbers of nuclear weapons. And he wants to do that. I know that this is a personal commitment of his. I know it's a vision that's shared by Vice President Biden and Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel. But what has happened is they've run into resistance. As the president said in an interview with 60 Minutes last year, it's a lot harder to do things than I thought. We've all seen that. And there's resistance to this by his political opponents who just want to stop him, period. By ideological opponents who believe that more weapons are better, but mainly by the bureaucracy, the people who have a vested financial interest in keeping the system just the way it is. And at this point, a lot of the resistance is coming from that. Democrats and Republicans alike who don't want to get rid of these weapons because they mean money to them. So, for example, a group of senators that represent the ICBM states, the states where there are ICBMs, they just wrote the president telling him not to do an environmental impact study on what it would mean to eliminate just 50 silos. We got 450. But we want to take 50 out to reduce them under the new START treaty. They said don't do the study. They don't want the silos to be eliminated. Why? They don't want to lose the jobs associated with the silos. So you have a political, sort of fiscal strategy that you've got to develop to deal with people like that, give them an alternative revenue stream.
I'm not sure I answered the question as completely as you like. So
What I meant by the question is, let's say you were advising President Obama today. He says, hey, how many of these things do we need? What basis would you put to him for answering that question?
So what I was giving you was as why do we still have all these weapons?
Yeah.
That's why we still have them. How many do you need? You know, I'll give you what Chuck Hagel said. Here's what the Secretary of Defense said a few months before he was chosen to be Secretary of Defense. He said 450. And he wrote an excellent study for a group called Global Zero. We support them. With Tom Pickering, the former ambassador, and James Cartwright, the former general, who was the head of the Strategic Command. So Cartwright, Hagel, Pickering, Richard Burt, Reagan's former national security negotiator. They said 450 operational. That's what we can go down to. Keep another 450 in reserve, so a total force of 9,000. Right now we have a 900. Right now we have a total force of about 5,000 in the active stockpile. So I think that when you talk to security professionals who don't have a vested interest, those are the kinds of numbers you hear as at least an interim stage. You can get to there. Yes, ma'am.
People on the right are threatening war, as you say, and everything's on the table, and all the leaders have lined up to say, if we don't get an agreement, it's war. Do you think the American people would really support a war against Iran after what we've already been through? This is a country that does not threaten us.
Right. No, they would not, which is why the opponents for the negotiations don't call for war. They understand. You saw what happened with Syria.
Exactly.
Right. So Syria, I actually thought that military action was justified. Just so you know, I am not a pacifist.
Right.
And Plowshare is not a pacifist organization. I actually thought that we did need to strike Syria, that this was a major threat, the chemical weapons. That's not what the American people thought. And I talked to members of Congress, 1,000 emails, they would say to me. I got 1,000 emails over this. There's not one in support of striking Syria. It was a huge, unexpected response from the American people. I think the same is true for Iran, but the danger is you would slip into this. You would slip into this kind of conflict because Iran would then start doing things that others would say were threatening. So they would, for example, start enriching uranium to higher levels.
But
and Israel might decide it wants to take action irrespective of what the United States position is. They might call the question. The legislation that I'm talking about, this Nuclear-Free Iran Act of 2013 is what it's called. It says that if Israel should attack Iran, the United States should come to Israel's aid. So there's kind of a hook that's being put into the legislation so that if one country makes a terrible mistake, we're going to commit and go. And that's the kind of slippery slope that we have to worry about.
Would that pass?
There were 47 co-sponsors. There are 47 already.
And people have pointed out this Israel language.
Oh yes. There's an effort to push this for a vote this month. Similar legislation somewhat like this that would increase sanctions on Iran has already passed the House. So this is a real problem. The president has said he would veto it. So what if you get a veto proof?
Right.
What if you get enough senators to override a veto? So this is a real fight. Nothing is decided yet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martin.
Joe. Thanks. Hey, congratulations on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. You're re-stimulating me because I've had nuclear nightmares. Thanks a lot. And I'm here with Physicians for Social Responsibility and talk to Joe about circulating our petition for a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Physicians for Social Responsibility has been here since 1961, arguing that prevention is the only cure, therefore the solution to nuclear weapons is to get rid of them. And so I'll be sticking close to up here in front, and I'm here with our director, Catherine Thomason. So we have this petition to sign, and if you sign it, it'll do two things. One, you'll put yourself on record to the president that you support banning nuclear weapons. And two, if you give us your email address, you'll get on our security action alert list, and we'll be keeping you posted about important activities that we're involved in. I also have some materials about a report that we just came out with saying that if there's a war between India and Pakistan using merely 100 nuclear weapons, small scale, Hiroshima-sized weapons, that could degrade agriculture worldwide for 10 years, and 2 billion people would be at risk of starving.
So let me talk just briefly about that. Thank you very much, Martin. This is one of the other risks we have. Most experts believe that if a nuclear weapon is used in combat again, South Asia is the most likely region where this will be used. Pakistan has about 100 nuclear weapons, and they're building nuclear weapons faster than any other country in the world. India has about 100 nuclear weapons. These two countries share a common border. They've waged 4 wars over the last 60 years. They came close to war again since both of them acquired nuclear weapons. They've come close to war. 1 million men mobilized along the line, the border there at about 10, 12 years ago. The risk is that something happens, a terrorist incident. Remember the attacks on Mumbai back in November of 2008. A terrorist incident happens that forces an Indian response that leads to an incursion across the Pakistan border. The Pakistanis respond, the Indians escalate. This could get out of control. They could both start launching nuclear weapons, which they've now both have been developing on the tactical level, so giving them to battlefield commanders. Scientists have now calculated that as few as 100 nuclear weapons, this is what your study is based on, would put enough smoke and particulates in the Earth that it would cover the Earth in a cloud. This is the nuclear winter effect that scientists discovered in the 80s, but then their calculations were based on 500, 600, 700, the kind of global thermonuclear change. But with improved climate models, we now realize that as few as 100 in the densely populated urban areas of South Asia could produce this cloud that could drop global temperatures 2 to 3 degrees, that could kill many food crops in the world. And the physicians have calculated this could lead to 1 billion deaths in populations, particularly in countries where they're already marginal. So this is a risk that we have to face. Even if we do everything right, other countries might not. Go.
I also
Chapter 8 in the book, I call Pakistan the most dangerous country on earth. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has 100, and there's a much greater risk that some of those will be used.
I have 50, 60 questions, but
Go.
I see line of people.
Sorry.
I also work for a Physician for Social Responsibility, and my question is that, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, that on our website we publish a study that if we attack Iranian nuclear reactors, there will be nuclear meltdown, and that nuclear meltdown can affect 20 million people globally. So that is one of my question. If you have looked into that, like if push comes to shove, as sanctions never have worked in the history of mankind, it's not going to work now. They are not working now. What is the second question is about NPT, a very short question, and I can repeat my question. Do you see NPT structure under threat in recent, as Russia has moved his tactical missiles, SS-26, close to Poland, in reaction to America's missile defense system? So,
Good. There's an international convention that bans attacking another country's nuclear installations, including nuclear reactors, for exactly the reasons you put out. If you attack a nuclear reactor, you're going to be spewing that radioactive material. Think of Fukushima, think of Chernobyl, think of 3 Mile Island. You'll be creating one of those. So I don't know if the casualty figures are correct, but if you were to attack Bushehr, that's absolutely right. That's the kind of regional catastrophe that you could trigger. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, has been around since Johnson started negotiating it, and Richard Nixon finished the job and signed it with a flourish in a Rose Garden ceremony in 1970. It has provided the legal and diplomatic framework that has allowed countries to give up nuclear weapons. We've actually had more countries end their nuclear weapons programs in the last 30 years than we had tried to start them. And this was some very tough cases like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Libya, Iraq, South Africa, countries, Brazil, Argentina, countries that gave up their programs. So the NPT provides that kind of framework, but it's based on a bargain. And the bargain is these countries promise not to build nuclear weapons. In exchange, the countries that have nuclear weapons agree to get rid of them. Agree to get rid of them, not just reduce them, get rid of them. And as long as the nuclear arsenals are coming down and people are seen as making good faith efforts, that holds. But if either side destabilizes, if Iran goes nuclear, that destabilizes the whole NPT. You could see many more countries follow suit. If the countries become convinced that those with nuclear weapons are never going to give them up, then that encourages a proliferation. So it's a fragile bargain. It's holding pretty well right now, but it is in more threat. Many people think it's more threatened now than it has been in 10, 15 years.
We're going to take questions for the people who are in line now.
Okay.
Everybody's going to get a chance to ask their question.
And I will be shorter. I'm sorry for taking so long.
Treaty is supreme law of the land, and as you say, we have an NPT treaty, and it is not merely political. Not proliferation is a transpolitical issue. What we need now is responsible use of language and leadership, and we must restore the expectation there will be no first use. There is not an opportunity to particularize, to be taken up in international diplomacy, but only, as you suggested, an alternative revenue securitization. We have both knowledge securitization going on and the alternative revenue of our better secure oil and production in the world. For example, gas pension bonds are supposed to be this year very secure and restore stability in areas where formerly oil production was unstable. And I am wondering why you don't have confidence in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or in the International Monitoring and Verification Agency, which has added protocol and completed the annexation. And I do not know why you don't respect also the additional International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Commission support of both Japan and Australia.
Okay, let me answer that. I do have faith in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but treaties are living documents. You know, you pass them, but they have to be, they're enforced by human beings, by countries that decide. And if the country doesn't enforce the agreements, they lapse. So the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, even though the U.S. Senate has not ratified it, has been a hugely effective barrier to the development of nuclear weapons because most countries have now given up nuclear testing. Even though some people have violated the spirit of that pact, countries that haven't signed it, North Korea tested, Iran, India, Pakistan tested, they're seen as outliers. Those tests are now condemned. They're seen as outside the pale. But nuclear tests used to be the norm. We conducted 1,000 of them. You know, everybody used to pop these things off. Now doing so is internationally condemned. So you've seen that restraining effect. I don't think we've seen the last nuclear test, but we're real close. So I do have faith in that. And the international monitoring system that's been built up, maybe you saw this front page story in the Washington Post on January 2nd, has been a very effective instrument for being able to detect nuclear tests wherever they occur. Yes, sir.
Yes, good evening. In the United States, what happens to decommissioned nuclear weapons and decommissioned nuclear fuel?
Got it. Decommissioned nuclear, so fuel that's used up, we don't know what to do with it. It's a waste product. It's a poisonous waste product. There was supposed to be an international deposit, a national depository for this. Maybe you remember Yucca Mountain. Well, the people in Nevada decided they didn't want Yucca Mountain to be the place where everybody brought their fuel. So that fuel is backing up in nuclear reactors around the country. We have about 103 nuclear reactors. The waste product from those reactors is now stored in storage pools at reactors. It's like the sewage system just backing up. It's one of the great unsolved problems of nuclear power. What do you do with the waste? Nuclear weapons, as it turns out, we know what to do with. We take them apart. There's about 7,000 parts in a regular nuclear weapon. You take it all apart. You get rid of all that stuff. Most of it's just recycled metal. You're left with the core. Mm-hmm. If that core is uranium, we can downblend the uranium, and we can help other countries downblend. We actually bought 500 tons of highly enriched uranium that were taken out of Soviet warheads. We bought that, and we downblended that 500 tons into fuel. And we sold the fuel to American power reactors, American power companies, and they burned that fuel to power their nuclear reactors. Over the last 10 years, about 10% of the electricity in the United States has come from energy generated from former Soviet warheads. So we know how to do this. So about half the fuel in nuclear reactors over the last 10 years has come from this reused uranium. The problem then comes when that fuel is used up. We still don't know what to do with that. But nuclear weapons, once you take them apart, we pretty much know what to do with it. The plutonium is a different problem. The plutonium does not have a civilian use, does not have a way to economically and safely use that as a fuel. It is a waste project that has to be disposed of in deep geological depositories. Sir.
I want to address purely the issue of what do we do with Iran?
Yeah.
And the following is the question of a change of government, let's put aside for a minute, because you can argue that we didn't get very good results with changes of government so far. But would you couple any requirement that Iran commit to limit its unhealthy interventions in adjacent countries? And let's get back to what I think is the hardest question, is you postulate that there is a way to get to control the process.
Yeah.
Could you ever get the Iranians to accept one that we think is effective and they would not think is a derogation of sovereignty?
Yeah. Well, sovereignty is a very important issue. And when the Iranians talk about it, they use the word respect. They want respect. Back in September, I had dinner with the newly elected president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani. I actually met him in Tehran in 2005 when he was the nuclear negotiator for the Iranian government. And there was a dinner of about 30 foundation presidents, think tank leaders, and it was all off the record. But the things he said there were similar to things he said publicly. So let me tell you one thing he said. He was asked directly, so why don't we just why don't we do one big deal? Why don't we go and do one big deal? People were making references to the Shanghai Communique when Nixon went to China, where there was a major reconciliation that took place, a whole lot of principles and agreements laid out that were then, over the next several decades, translated. Why don't we take one big deal and do it all, not just deal with the nuclear issue, deal with relations with Israel, support for Hezbollah, similar to what the Iranians had proposed we talk about when they tabled a proposal in 2003, where they said, let's talk about the nuclear program, relations with Israel, relations with our Arab neighbors, support for Hezbollah, relations between the United States. And he said, Iranian-American relations are very complex. We have a long and troubled history. The table will not support all these issues at once. So we have to start small. And both sides have agreed, and now I know what he was talking about. We had some secret talks that weren't been revealed yet. This is before the phone call between Obama and Rouhani. He said both sides have agreed we start with the nuclear. And we take a step that can build confidence, that you can take the next two steps, and so on and so on. And I think that's the path we're on. I'm convinced that Iran wants to make a deal, not because they're afraid of us, although there's some of that. The threats that we face, they take seriously, not because they want to be our friend. Rouhani is not a reformer in the sense that we think. He's a regime man. He wears the turban. He's loyal to the regime. He has the confidence of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, who's an ideological leader that is opposed to the United States, not because he wants to be a friend, but because this is what's best for Iran. Because the election in June showed, and I believe the elite opinion has now shifted in Iran, to say they want out. Their economy has been crippled by these sanctions. They have a mandate to end these, to improve the economy. In order to do that, you have to end the sanctions. In order to do that, you have to reach a compromise on the nuclear program. I think they're willing to do that. I think the nuclear program is much less important to them, particularly this leadership, than some people believe. And they're willing to do that because they're playing a much bigger game. This is not about a Manhattan Project to build a bomb. This is about restoring Iran's role in the region, a region that they believe, a role they believe that they are destined to play. They've been there for 3,000 years. For most of those 3,000 years, they have been the leading state in the region. That's what they want again. And nuclear weapons don't help them do that. It stops them from doing that. It stops them from doing that. That's why I think there's a dynamic underway that if we just seize it, and we have a Secretary of State and we have a president who want to do this, if we just let them get the job done, I think we can solve this problem. It won't make everything else disappear, but it opens the door that at least has the possibility for resolving many of these other issues, including the critical issue of relations with Israel. Ma'am.
Okay, last question. As you well know, we have the energy labs scattered across the United States.
Yes.
I wonder if you have any thoughts as to where they can go to be helpful in a number of areas.
Yes.
Also, I don't follow this very carefully. Are there new directions in their leadership? Are they doing useful peace-building kind of things?
Kind of. So all the labs have other areas, and over the past, since the end of the Cold War, they have actually shot off in some areas. I have a colleague, Phil Coyle, who used to be the deputy director of one of these labs, who greatly enlarged during his tenure the energy work that they were doing and alternative energy forms, and that took off. And then it kind of got the money from the weapons contracts came back in. It was too good to pass up. So if you go to, as I have, to Livermore National Laboratory in California, they get $1 billion a year from the Department of Energy to do weapons work. They get, I think it's maybe $100 million for everything else. So they have other things, supercomputers, energy work. It's just a small slice of their revenue stream. Now, I talked to the director of Livermore Labs, and he says, do you think that I think I'm going to get $1 billion a year from the government for weapons 10 years from now? I know this is shrinking. I know. My question is, how do I make the transition? So they're aware of the problem. And with this kind of money, you realize there's a solution here. You've got to find a way that the national government can work with the strong defenders politically of these labs, the senators and state representatives who represent these states, to find this alternative revenue stream, to build that in, to keep that talent pool going, to keep that national asset going, but put it to more productive uses. I think there's an answer there, but part of it's got to be cutting the weapons revenue stream and replacing it with an alternative energy, supercomputer, etc. revenue stream. That it's all about the money. It's all about the money. I think I'm out of time. I want to thank you very much for letting me come here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.